All right, on this episode, we have Matt Traldi, who is the CEO of Greenlight America. One of the biggest challenges our membership faces, particularly our developers and our EPCs, is permitting locally when they're trying to build a project.
Yeah. And Greenlight is doing absolutely fabulous work on community engagement and sort of partner building and support building in communities all across the country to not necessarily just focus on, what can we do to get this project permitted, which they do, but also how can we kind of really build a much more comprehensive sort of national network of people to help move these things forward. And he had so many amazing things to say about like the stories that are coming out of these communities and the opportunities that exist that I think a lot of our companies are not necessarily aware of.
Right. The benefits to these solar projects actually going up in the community. There's significant economic benefits and long-term economic benefits to these communities. And he has a lot to say about that. So hopefully folks can tune in and hear not just what all the good, but some of the challenges that go into every single project that these folks are trying to build.
Yeah. And, he said at one point sort of come on in, the water's fine. And I think that's a really important message. And I hope people listen to this episode and hear about, what he has to offer and what their organization has to offer as an example of why not to necessarily be afraid to really engage in your community.
Tune in. We'd love to start the conversation today by having you tell us about Greenlight. How did you get started? How did you get off the ground? And maybe some of the challenges that you're trying to solve for with your organization.
Absolutely. So first, by way of background, I'm new to the clean energy industry. I spent around a decade in the labor movement. And then after that, in 2016, I was one of the co-founders of Indivisible, a national grassroots network that sprung up to respond to the first time Trump won the presidency. And a few years ago, a couple things happened at once. First, while I was at Indivisible, I got to work a little bit on passing the Inflation Reduction Act, and I felt and still feel a lot of excitement and optimism about this area of work. And right around the same time, my wife and I decided to become parents. We've got a toddler now. It's a cliche, but for me, it changed my time horizon a little bit. Yeah. I was thinking a lot about what's life going to be like in 50 years? What are the things we can do that make the biggest difference for that? And as you all know, emissions reduction rises pretty high on that particular list. Yeah. So I started learning as much as I could by talking to folks who'd been thinking about that challenge for longer than me, and learned some things that you and probably many of your listeners already know. In the next decade, 80% plus of the emissions reduction comes from the power sector, mainly from building large clean energy projects and taking fossil fuels off the grid as a result. And I also learned that the big obstacle to doing that was not the technology, which is very well proven at this point. It was not how much it costs. This is the cheapest and fastest energy to deploy. It was local permitting, that small numbers of opponents across the country would show up. They'd make a lot of noise. Supporters were not showing up in the kind of local venues that matter. And as a result, clean energy was kind of losing by forfeit in those places. And that immediately, my ears perked up because I'm really interested in all the technology aspects of this work, but I would have to go back in time and make some pretty different life choices to be helpful at those, right? But organizing and campaigning, those are the things I've spent my career doing, local politics, that sort of thing. And so I thought to myself, this is a challenge that I can help with. And so I and a few other folks started Greenlight America. It's a very simple organization. We track those critical local moments where a small number of local supporters can make all the difference in terms of whether a project gets approved or denied, or whether an ordinance gets passed that enables development, or a ban functionally gets passed. And then we find and support local residents who support clean energy. We help them advocate effectively, and we help win favorable decisions at that local level. Since we started, we had our first campaign win in January of 2024, and we've now advanced more than 25 gigawatts across our different campaigns of clean power across the U.S. So it's a very exciting time, and eager to be here with you.
I feel like a lot of times when we have this conversation about the barriers that you mentioned at the local level, it starts on the negative. And we're going to get to that, all the reasons that you sort of founded this organization. But I'd love to maybe start by like thinking about it a little more positively, and like the story that you're trying to tell with those local supporters that you mentioned. Like what is it that you're sort of like tying back to as often as you can to talk about the benefits of these projects to the local community.
Yeah, absolutely. And, really it is an overwhelmingly positive story.
Yeah.
Clean energy is winning out there in the country. This is most of what gets built now.
Yeah.
And a couple other things I would highlight. The first is that clean energy is very popular. Even if you ask folks, would you support it in your own community? Not just do you think it's good in the abstract, but in your own community, would you support it? It pulls very well. It tends to be very popular. That's across all different kinds of communities and all different kinds of places, across political lines, all of those sorts of things. And, the other thing I would say, we think really about two audiences, if you will, when we're thinking about our work. The first is the volunteers we work with, the folks who do support clean energy, and they're deciding whether to show up. I mentioned earlier I have a toddler, so for me, deciding to show up for anything is a big commitment.
Yeah.
I have to really figure out what the trade-offs are in my life. I only want to do it when it's really worthwhile. And these are incredibly high impact moments for local volunteers to participate. I do this work because of emissions. I mentioned this earlier. And if 10 local volunteers show up and help get a mid-sized utility scale solar project approved in an afternoon, that's the equivalent of planting roughly 4 million trees. So it's like that afternoon, each of them personally planted 400,000 trees.
Yeah.
That's faster than I can plant trees, at least myself. Maybe with, some special equipment, you could go that fast. But that's all just to say that, first and foremost, that's who we tend to be talking to. We're trying to support those local supporters, those local partner organizations, make this easy for them. And we try to share this really exciting thing, which is, based on the incredible projects that people in this industry are building and the incredible impact they can have. This is a really, really high impact high impact way to get involved as a volunteer. And as you know, many of us do a lot of volunteering that's not so high impact because we really want to do something. We want to help, I recycle. I hear all the podcasts about how some of the things I recycle, maybe it's not even really helping, but I still want to do it because I still want to do something with a high impact, right?
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity where people can have a really outsized impact. Then the second thing, of course, is we think about the communities that are deciding whether to host these projects. And something that I try to remind myself of and talk about a lot when talking to folks who maybe this is their first time working on a clean energy project is, if you're a county councilor in a community considering one of these projects, you're not deciding, is climate change real? You're not deciding, is clean energy good? You're deciding, should we build this project here? Is this project going to be good for our community? What are we going to get out of it? What are the cons of building it here? What are the downsides? And what do my constituents think? Because, you're a local elected leader. You care about your constituents. That's who you were elected to serve. And there too, these projects are really awesome. In particular, one thing I would mention there that we end up talking about on every single project pretty much is the tax revenue and other public economic benefit that comes out of these projects. They're often some of the biggest taxpayers in the community. And as y'all know, most of these projects are in rural areas. Rural communities in the U.S. have faced decades of disinvestment. Some of them have declining tax bases. So this can be a really important investment in the community. It really helps it preserve a way of life, preserve a community the way it has been for a long time. So that I think is, one of the very exciting things about doing this work.
I just want to highlight, we don't often hear people talk about these projects as helping preserve the communities and preserve a way of life. Yes, there's additive growth benefits, but I think that's a really important point that, it's not just about what this can offer to the community in the future, but it's also about safeguarding what they've already built, which I think is a super important message.
I think that's, I really appreciate you highlighting that because to me, but when we talk to folks in these communities, people usually like the community they're in. I know for me, I like the neighborhood I live in. I want to see it stay the way it is. Of course I do want to see something strengthened about it, but at the end of the day, I like it. I like the lifestyle that I have in the community I live in. And people in these places are no different. Yeah. And so, that's something that I think inevitably with these projects, there's this element of there's an outside company coming in.
Right.
And, they're saying they're going to make everything better, but they're outsiders. They don't know the way things are here. And they want to change things for us. And that I think can be kind of a dangerous path to go down. Whereas preserving, again, is really, really can be really valuable and can be celebrated by everyone.
Right. Yeah. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into this question. Obviously, the economic impact, the environmental impact of these projects can be significant in a local community. And as the National Trade Association that represents developers and EPCs, we a lot of our folks have a significant interest in how to do this work well. Mm-hmm. What would you say to them? What advice would you give to some of our members in terms of steps they should take before they're even considering going into one of these communities?
Yeah. So this is such an important question. I'm glad y'all are thinking about it. And I know that many folks in the industry are thinking a ton about it as well. And, the first thing that I would say is, I guess it's like a come on in, the water's fine type thing to say, which is that in every community we've worked in, when we started Greenlight, we thought, surely there will be some places that we find supporters and find supportive partner organizations. Maybe that won't be everywhere, and that would be fine. It would still be worthwhile if we do this in the places where those folks are. And instead we have yet to find a place where there's no one who's supportive, there's no supportive partner organizations and so forth. And I think there can be a natural hesitancy that folks have. Maybe they've been burned before. They've worked with some, seemingly innocuous local group that then turned out to be very opposed to any kind of development, that sort of thing. And I think that can create a kind of hesitancy to engage. And what we've found is there are tons of people and tons of partner organizations that are ready to support these projects. They are really exciting projects for the community, for, again, the kind of global impact that, is why I do this work. And that a closer partnership between industry and nonprofits and local residents can really make all the difference in these situations. Of course, a developer and a local nonprofit and an individual in the community are different kinds of people and, engaging in some different kinds of ways, but we all have a shared goal, which is to get this stuff built and to see the benefits that that's going to bring to the community. So that's, I think, thing number one that I would say. That's something also that, Greenlight can help with. We're always happy to introduce developers to partner organizations and to local supporters. Mm-hmm. I think, the other thing I would say here is it can be tempting to think about these kinds of things as, I guess, a 50% plus one popular support, right? I mentioned the polling earlier on clean energy. But in my experience, that's not really how the decision gets made. There's no poll, there's no, voting day where everyone turns out and pulls the lever. There's a hearing or a series of hearings. There's a really small number of people in the room usually. And whoever shows up is going to make the difference, right? And, having been to many of these hearings at this point, if you're a local decision maker and the first handful of people speak against the project, it feels like it'd be almost political suicide for them to go forward, right? Like everyone's opposed. Right. If the first few people speak up in favor of it, it feels like this is going to sail through. It's great. Everyone loves this, right? And so that's, I think, the other thing I would say is it's easy to get distracted by the allure of how do we win over 50% plus one of the community, but really having those 10 or 20 people who are ready to be supportive in the, ready to show up, ready to speak out for the project, that sort of thing, can make all the difference. And so making sure that we spend just as much time talking to our supporters and preparing them and so forth as we do on, kind of general public opinion. Yeah. And often, for these projects, there are landowners, there are other folks who are kind of like natural supporters, and that would be a place to start too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, how do you go about kind of separating or distinguishing between valid and sort of fact-based concerns about, community impact or whatever the case may be versus some of the things that are more, bubbling up from the cesspool of social media or, maybe coming from places that are not, shall we say, operating in good faith and separating the fact from fiction and like myth busting where needed, while also addressing valid concerns and sort of that's just like a tightrope that you sometimes have to walk. I'd love to hear how you guys think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say here that Greenlight is an independent nonprofit. We're philanthropically funded, and so we're probably in a slightly different position for this question than the developer is themselves, right? One of the things that I've learned over the years about communications in general and this sort of thing in particular is it's so important to not get caught spending all of your time talking about what the opposition wants to talk about. It's very easy, particularly when some of the things that we're hearing from opponents are so outrageous. The temptation I'm part of what George W. Bush called the fact-based community. I just want to say, as a member of the fact-based community, the temptation to respond to every outrageous claim is so overwhelming. But it doesn't necessarily help. And there's this interesting and consistent finding about disinformation over the years that if you fact-check disinformation, most people have no real way of knowing whether the disinformation or the fact-checking was true. What they remember is there was a controversy and that a lot of people were talking about the bad thing that was in the disinformation. That's what really sticks.
Because negativity is easier to recall.
Yeah. That's right. Absolutely. And so for that reason, most of the time, it's best to not get drawn into too much fact-checking, particularly, again, if you're, an independent organization like us, to spend as much time as possible talking about the positives, right? The message for what the project can do for the community. And we use, this is borrowed from my time at Indivisible, we use George Lakoff's strategy called the truth sandwich for combating disinformation, which is to not fact check it, but to instead start with a shared value, something that you think you and the audience have in common, to address without mentioning the disinformation, so to kind of undercut why are people spreading this kind of disinformation in the first place, and then to refocus the conversation on the thing that you think is most important for making the decision. So it might be economic benefits, it might be, something else, but rather than, again, doing this fact-checking. Now, where it gets a little complicated, so that's all, all well and good. I would say particularly if you're the developer for a project, people will bring up factual questions that it's good to answer. And this is a technical field. I've been struck since beginning to work in clean energy. I've been struck by how many projects there's some technical issue that comes up that does require a fair bit of nuance to understand, about decommissioning panels, about stormwater runoff, about we worked on a project where we needed to learn about cable dredging because that was a really essential issue for the way the project was going to work. And so, there I would say the thing to bear in mind is, this is another old quote. It's not what you say about the issues; it's what the issues say about you. That most people are not necessarily going to know every technical detail of the project, but the way in which the developer shares information and answers questions, and the fact that they've thought about issues and are, maybe listening to people in the community, organizations that have expertise in that area, that can really make a difference. A project we work on in Pennsylvania that we were really proud of is a solar project on reclaimed mine land, which sounds super cool, right? It turns out there are a lot of watershed issues with working on reclaimed mine land, which once I heard this, it made total sense to me, but it hadn't occurred to me in advance. And the local watershed association was worried about the project and I think maybe on track to oppose. And we were able to help the developer and the Watershed Association have a good conversation. And the Watershed Association came out of that thinking like, this company, they want to do the right thing.
Right.
They don't want to screw anyone over. They listen, if we see problems, we're going to be able to pick up the phone. Yeah. And that moved them to, being pretty positive about the project, and it ended up getting approved. That wasn't the only reason, but I do think it probably helped.
Yeah, no, that's encouraging.
I'm so impressed by the work that you do, and I'm curious tactically how you can be so successful. In the end, you guys aren't coming in at the beginning of a project. You're coming in when there's already a problem. And we've talked about disinformation and misinformation and myths and challenges on the ground. how do you come in and at a late stage in the game and drive such tremendous progress?
Oof, well, that's and certainly we win some and we lose some. That is certainly true. It is challenging. But so I think a couple of things that we've learned so far about this engagement. I mentioned earlier, we found there are supporters everywhere and supportive organizations, and we've learned that people really want to be effective. They want to be effective advocates. The people who live in these communities, they know their communities. Even if, for example, climate change might be motivating to them, they know whether or not it's going to be motivating to their neighbors and whether or not to talk about it and, want to hear what will help them be effective. I think really focusing in on those moments where there's something for volunteers to do that's really tangible, like showing up at a hearing, signing a letter of support, writing an op-ed, something in that kind of crescendo moment where the permitting is kind of coming to a head. That feels really impactful for the volunteers, and that in turn means it's easier to get people's attention and energy. So those are really important. I do think that there are probably two kinds of situations where local supporters can make the biggest difference, and that's really how I think about our work: is like, when can we help local supporters? When is that really going to matter for the outcome? One is, there are a lot of situations where the local decision makers, they probably want the project. They don't want a hassle. They see the potential economic benefits for the community, but at the end of the day, they were elected by their constituents, by their neighbors, and so if there's a lot of opposition and no support, that's very challenging for them to move forward. Sometimes in these situations, that same decision maker has even said to the developer, for example, "Don't worry, I support what you're doing. You don't need to mobilize people. You don't need to do any of this. It's fine." But then if everyone who shows up in the process is negative, it really is hard to stay the course. And so in those situations, even a small number of local voices who are in support can make such a huge difference, because it allows the decision makers to say accurately, look, there are people here who support this project. There are people who are on both sides. And so I've got to decide what I think is best for the community, and here's my decision. And, we often hear decision makers cite that when they come out with a favorable decision. They'll say, I know there are a lot of people here who have expressed concerns about this project, and we've also heard from a lot of people who support it, and that's why I'm going forward here. And so that's one kind of situation. The other is, you do have folks who are genuinely undecided, right? This might be the first clean energy project they've considered. They might not know that much about it themselves. And so in those situations, honestly, we have to see if more supporters will show up than opponents. If they can be more effective advocates, if we can. I wouldn't say we try to compete on turning up the volume, because that's sometimes it's not good to keep turning up the volume,
right.
But just to show really the strength, the depth and breadth of support for the project in the community, and all the different ways that it would benefit the community can be really important. Those situations to actually change the mind of the decision maker. But every community is different, and every project is different, and so we do think we've learned some things, and also each one's a new challenge.
You talked a lot about some of the local partner organizations, and I'm curious your maybe some of the examples that you could give of surprising perhaps partners or allies that we might not be thinking about. I know that our industry is not necessarily unique in facing sort of local opposition to economic development. It's a tale as old as time. But have you found any sort of interesting, unlikely bedfellows in doing this work that our industry needs to maybe tap into a bit more?
Sure. Two that come to mind. I guess first thing I should say is we're privileged to have worked with more than 200 different local partners and state and national based partners on projects and ordinances over the last couple of years. And that's by design. We're very much like, we're here to help. This is the only thing we do.
Yeah.
We know that for most partner organizations, they do lots of different things.
Right.
And because any one community, they might have one project and then not another one for a few years, maybe never another one, it can be hard for most of our partners to build an entire program and strategy around clean energy deployment, because it kind of comes in and then the opportunity is gone. They're on to the next thing, right? Whereas for us, this is all we do, and we go from place to place. So, we're happy to work with anyone. And in particular, our focus is on finding and helping local supporters, people who actually live in the community, show up, because we think those are the most influential voices with local electeds. And so really anyone who has members in the local community, could be a good partner for us.
Mm-hmm.
But, two that I would kind of pop out just as examples. The first one is, this was just a very proud moment for me. We worked with an Odd Fellows Lodge on one of our projects in Washington. And the Odd Fellows are like one of these old civic associations,
Mm-hmm.
Like the Kiwanis Club or something like that. So it was just kind of like a cool organizing moment for me, having done this work for a while, to come across them. And it was just a very cool local group. They stayed in close touch. They were excited about the project, and they hadn't done clean energy work before. And so, that was a really cool opportunity. Then another one I'd highlight, we work with some conservative groups,
Mm-hmm.
and one I'd pop out, which I believe some of SIA's members work with as well, as Land and Liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a great partner. And part of the reason that is really satisfying for me is we're in a time of very divisive national politics, to say the least.
Yeah.
I am, we would need beers for this conversation if we were going to talk about bipartisan national action.
Yeah,
that's like a whole, and so it can be really nice that, at the local level, outside of maybe the spotlight on national politics, it's still the case that, mainly these are conservative communities where projects are getting built. A lot of the decision makers are conservative, and we're able to work across the aisle just on, is this good for the community? Is it in line with what we want to see more of built, rather than it getting caught in, again, so it's a little bit of a bright light in a time where, again, it's maybe harder to find some of that common ground here in DC, where I'm based.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I love to talk about a bright light in the
we need more of them, that's for sure.
That's right.
I don't want to let you go, though, without telling us what you really think about what we're up against, because in the end, we know we have big opponents out there. And when we talk about needing every electron being added to the grid because demand is going up, we mean it when we say it, but we know that there is a powerful operation in the field working against renewable energy. What do you think about how powerful they are and what we're up against as an industry over the next 10 years?
Yeah, there's so many different directions to take this question. So
you do you, whatever's most comfortable.
Sounds good. A couple of different things I would say. First, something that I try to remind myself of on this work overall is that I actually feel an enormous amount of confidence that we're going to transition our power sector to clean energy. And I mentioned earlier, I do this work for my daughter, and I'm thinking about what life is going to be like in 50 years. And so the exact speed that we do it at really matters for that. And so, I think we're on this really positive trajectory, but the real enemy to me is time, rather than our opposition. And that every project we work on has just such high stakes. Whether we can get it approved and how quickly we can get it approved, how quickly we can get steel in the ground. And, that makes this work very meaningful. It does also make it, means the losses really hurt, right? When there's a lot of smart people who try to take lessons from their losses. I try to take lessons from my losses too, but I'm not going to lie, it really sucks to lose.
Yeah.
Particularly when the stakes are high. It's not just, losing or winning for the sake of losing or winning. It's that this really matters, right? So that's one thing I would say. I do think that a couple other things that I would say about this. We're not just in terms of the opposition that we're up against. Clean energy exists, of course, in this broader sociopolitical environment. And one aspect of the sociopolitical environment is a long-term disinvestment from organizing and social infrastructure in a lot of communities across the country, particularly rural communities, particularly among maybe the progressive leaning organizations that might be more likely to be supportive of clean energy as a starting place. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, but I think it's undeniable that it's happened. And, we can't build our way to the clean energy future we need without winning a lot of decisions in exactly those places, right, where we have seen this disinvestment. And, that can be daunting because it does mean that it's not like, showing up to a community, of course, and there's the local clean energy club.
Right.
It's usually harder than that.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, it means that this work really matters beyond just one project too, right? That if a developer, goes through the process of permitting in a community and working with local partners, both maybe engaging some local partners that haven't had a lot to win on in that community in the recent past, and then also maybe persuading some folks who might, if they listen to the national news, think their side is against clean energy,
right.
And then the project gets built, and then the community does benefit. And this is something you see, that's very heartening to me, is that often if you interview decision makers and prominent folks in these communities 5 or 10 years after the project gets built, even if they weren't that excited about it when it came in, usually there is some benefit, right? Like they do, and they do see that, people often say that. And so I think this has the opportunity to not just be a project by project situation, but also, to fuel a kind of rural renaissance, right? A different kind of investment in those communities. But it's a tough environment. And, I think something we like to say about our work at Greenlight, and I think this is true of developing these projects overall, is it's not rocket science, but it's hard. The things that we have to do to win a permit for a project in a lot of ways are really straightforward. We have to find the people and organizations in the community who are likely to be supportive or who stand to benefit from the project. We have to share the information with them about why. We have to help them be effective advocates. We have to answer their questions so they have the confidence to show up, because it's a technical subject. If you don't have that confidence, you're not going to want to stand in front of a room of your neighbors and say you're for it. And then we have to actually be there, do the work of showing up. But if we do those things, we can win in some really improbable places.
Well, that is a very encouraging place for us to land. Before we wrap, how can folks work with you? We obviously, our membership is facing all the kinds of problems and opportunities that you've highlighted. How can folks partner with you?
Yeah, so we love working closely with developers. As I mentioned earlier, we are a philanthropically funded organization, so we're not looking for developer funding or contracts or anything like that. But our work is much more effective if we're in really direct communication with the developer of a project. We can share what we hear from the community. They can, often share things that are tripwires that help us, make sure we're headed in the right direction as we talk to local supporters. And so one easy way, I'm at matt@greenlightamerica.org. Feel free to reach out. Greenlightamerica.org is our website. If you go to greenlightamerica.org/resources, that has a number of ways for individuals to get involved, and also a way to contact us if you want to be a partner organization, that sort of thing. So those are a few that I'd mentioned, but we'd be really excited to hear from some new folks and to find new opportunities to work with your members.
Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing, Matt. It's sorely needed.
Thank you for the work you're doing, and wonderful to be here with you.